I'm Allison Kanoti. I'm the Director of Forest Health and Monitoring with the Maine Forest Service, and just happy to have you guys here supporting this. Work with browntail moth and then forest pests. Okay, so let's go ahead and I guess folks can choose and implement maybe, and yeah, and we can head over to where the browntail moth is a little bit. The webs here by the school garden really caught my eye because I know for our school, my kids are at Old Town Elementary School, and I know for our school that school garden is really the heart of the school community, and it's an important part of their classroom and learning, and just imagining those kids in May and June when it's the best time of year to be outside, and you really they can't safely be in these areas where the webs have been over winter. So browntail moth, it's an invasive insect. It has been in Maine for more than 100 years. The last time there was an outbreak of any significance was really around the late 90s, early 2000s. We had about 10,000 acres of defoliation in the Casco Bay region at that point. And that was the peak of the outbreak. It was like 10,700 acres, something like that was the peak of the outbreak around that Casco Bay region. In 2010, we started to see the populations of browntail moth build. So we did have some defoliation right around 10,000 acres again in 2010. And then we had some wetter weather, and those populations were suppressed. So the outbreak was delayed a little bit. And then 2015, populations really started to build again. And we started seeing browntail in this area probably, 4 years ago, maybe, was around when we were really starting to see it pick up in the greater Bangor area, with first detections out towards Eddington, where it was probably brought by traffic, by people going from heavily infested areas to their home in Eddington. And then also Old Town was an area where we also saw spot infestations, probably related to personal travel as well. And the infestation around Bangor has really blossomed in the last couple of years, especially around the airport. And I think with that being sort of a bedroom community for a lot of towns where, do I want to say bedroom? Yes, where people are working there. The other way around, that's right, the other way around. It's an employment center for a lot of the area towns. I think that we're seeing a lot of impact in the lower Penobscot Valley from that population at this point. Where we see browntail moth most frequently are fruit trees and oak trees, also elm, some of the birches. They aren't real picky, especially as the populations get heavier. The person who used to manage this program before she retired in 2018 has complained to me that her sugar maples are loaded with browntail this year. So it's a species that we normally think is maybe not a favorite, but apparently they're doing very well in her sugar maples, and she doesn't really have a lot in her oak. So it's hard to say that there's a tree that you shouldn't look at for browntail moth. Back behind there on Monday, I found one in Atilia. So normally, again, I think that's kind of a one that you don't have to worry about too much. But if it's hardwood, it might have browntail moth. The webs for browntail moth are kind of variable. It's an example of one here that doesn't have a lot of silk on it. Sometimes they are really tightly silked. Some of these ones in this crabapple tree, they tend to have more than one leaf in them. There's a look-alike, which is a native silk moth, and we want to avoid clipping and destroying the native silk moth cocoons because those species are in decline, related in some part to browntail moth control efforts because of the biocontrols that were introduced to try to manage browntail moth and what is now called spongy moth or European gypsy moth. Those biocontrols are generalists on a number of different caterpillars, including our native silk moths. So that's something that we want to avoid removing. And then I brought this as well, thanks to Kenny. He suggested I get some props. So this is something that people often will send us pictures of and think that they have browntail moth. This is a spent web of fall webworm. Again, a generalist in hardwood trees. And one of the differences between browntail and fall webworm is that the useful life of this web is really over. And so it's falling apart, it's degrading. With browntail moth, they're still very important this time of year. The silk is very tight. I got an email today from somebody who said he thinks it's one of the strongest things on the planet because he pulled apart the web to see what was inside. And they really are very tough to pull apart. They're very well silked together from the activity of the feeding caterpillars. So we used to always say, well, don't worry about handling the winter webs. There's no toxic hairs on them, and it's really not a hazard. But as the populations have built and more people are handling them, we get more reports from people who have had exposures to the hairs during the winter time. And so there's a couple of ways that can happen. One is that the caterpillar hairs can be on the host trees from the previous activity of the mature caterpillars in the spring. The toxin in them is very stable. It can be toxic for more than 3 years. Another way that it can happen is, people do have a variation in their sensitivity to these sorts of things. So it could just be that they're particularly sensitive to those types of irritants. And then finally, because of the warmer late summer temperatures, the caterpillars may be overwintering in a more mature state. And so they may have developed the larger hairs with more volume of the toxin in them. So we do recommend that people protect their skin, protect your eyes from getting hairs in them, those sorts of things, to try to avoid unnecessary aggravation. I generally am pretty sensitive to them. I haven't had a lot of trouble with winter webs, but I can tell you that after a couple hours, I start to feel a little itchy around my neck. Even it's probably all just in my mind. The other thing that, and maybe I'll defer to the professionals here, but the other thing to think about is, especially for homeowners or volunteers clipping webs, just be aware of safety. There are certain things that homeowners should not do. You should hire a professional arborist for. So if you have to get off the ground, think about hiring a professional arborist. Like, probably shouldn't send my kid up in my neighbor's tree to clip the webs out of her apple tree. If there's overhead lines, hire a professional. If there's a lot of traffic, you might want to think about hiring a professional. Just in general, bear in mind safety. It's far more important than getting those webs. Okay, so the other thing that is important is you can't just clip the webs out of the trees. You actually have to gather them up and then destroy them. And there's 2 methods that we recommend. One is burning them. That's my preferred method. The toxin in the hairs is actually broken down by heat. And so it's not like poison ivy. If you burn poison ivy, you're going to expose yourself to the toxins in the poison ivy and you're going to get a rash. With browntail moth, the toxin's actually broken down by the heat. And so it's not active if you burn them. The other method is soaking. And I'll just say these guys have a really strong will to live. So if you're going to soak them, you really need to think about soaking them for 2 or 3 days overnight in soapy water. And then I would even dispose of them afterwards in the trash. I would be extra careful. I can give you an example. I talked to somebody who had a contract for control of browntail moth for clipping the webs. But in the contract, they had nothing about removal of them. And so they ended up with these piles of webs. And I got a call in the spring, like, how do we dispose of these? I was like, well, you can try soaking them. It's like, well, that's too much volume. We can't soak them. It's like, well, can you burn them? Like, no, we can't burn them. And so I was like, well, you could try double bagging them and putting them out in the sun. That didn't work. So, really, if you're going to have a contract for removal, you want a contract to have in that contract destruction as well, because you don't want to end up dealing with them coming out of the webs in the spring.
Do you think it's like the populations are correlated to like any specific aspect of climate change? Wetter weather, higher precipitation, lower precipitation?
Yeah, so Ellie Groden out of the University of Maine, she's retired now, but she did some work on browntail moth and looking at climate. variables along with their populations using the defoliation estimates as the population metric. And what she found was that the temperatures in late August and early September, so that warmer temperatures were associated with, statistically significant with climate buildup. And then the other important factor was spring precipitation. So having that wetter temperatures in the May and June period was important for population collapse.
Does just the heavy rain and stuff kind of mess with the web?
No, they did also try to mess with the web. And so, what they found is that insecticides will work in helping to control the caterpillars within the webs. So for instance, like a citrus-based insecticide or like a pyrethroid, something like that, will actually kill the caterpillars within the web. But they're still hoping to do more work on seeing if there's a way to disrupt them, because they spend so much time in that, what you would think would be a vulnerable position, but it really isn't. They're really, really snug in there, very happy. So, yeah.
Are there any low temperatures that can kill them?
Not that we've really experienced. So Regina actually did a lot of winter mortality work with us, and we just really haven't seen a lot of impacts of cold winter weather on their populations. I don't know. We had webs up in Fort Fairfield and Smyrna and Monticello, and I don't know. We didn't actually take them in to look at winter mortality. I don't know if we might have had, maybe the populations wouldn't build there, but when you look at the old maps from like 1915, in New Brunswick, they were up at that latitude. I assume they were also up at that latitude in Maine. So.
Are we looking at, are there any inclination that the parasitic wasps and stuff like that are doing their job and pushing out these brown-tailed moths from their natural habitats, encouraging them to stay out in these places that don't have a higher content of the parasitic wasp?
Yeah, I don't know.
We also have the parasitic fly too here in Maine that they released back to the brown-tailed moth.
Yeah.
As well, back in the early 1900s and again, I think in the 1700s, 1800s.
I don't think anybody's really looked at that. Carla Boyd did her master's work on the natural controls of brown-tailed moth, and she did find, quite a bit of hyperparasitism actually. So as the parasites built up, there were parasites upon the parasites that also built up.
Do you know what Professor Angela Meck is doing?
Yeah, so Angela Meck is actually filled Ellie Grodin's position, was hired to fill Ellie Grodin's position. She's a forest entomologist, and she's working on looking at the different strains of BTK to see if there's a formulation that is more effective against brown-tailed moth, because BT is a Lepidopteran-specific insecticide that's organic registered. And so she's working on that. They're getting some different results, so that's good. She's also working on looking at whether we can use pheromones to better monitor populations, because right now brown-tailed moth population monitoring is a lot of time on the road. And yeah, so seeing if the pheromone would be effective in monitoring. We did a small trial this past summer. They at least respond to pheromone, but they're going to have to do some more work on the pheromone in order to actually have it be helpful. And then also see if we can use mating disruption as a control method, so spreading the pheromone across the landscape to confuse the males that are out there. I think those are the things that she's primarily working on. She is also looking at a small project to look at lighting to see if there's truly is a higher concentration around lights. Yeah.
How to see them?
Yeah, so this isn't an ideal day to be looking for brown-tailed moth webs. In general, we recommend going out on a sunny day, having the sun behind you, and looking at the tips of the branches, sort of the upper and outer portions of the crown. I would caution, though, that sometimes with fruit trees, we see them a little bit more interior, with some of those newer branches being on the inside of the fruit trees as well. So that's the general gist of ID. Hardwood trees, upper and outer portions of the crown. That oak tree back there by the school, you can see some webs way up the top of that. Likewise, these oak trees along the road have high webs, that elm tree there as well. And then, some of the lower webs are a little bit easier to see with the naked eye. But you'll often find the egg mass right on the outside of the web as well. So they're all there as a sibling group. They're kind of huddled together for the winter. And they feed together as a sibling group very early in the spring. And then towards late May, they start to wander and feed more singly. And that's when people really start to get exposure to those hairs because the caterpillars are wandering. There's a lot of molts that have already happened. So there's lots of the hairs in the environment. And those caterpillars will wander from late May through June. Usually pupation wraps up by the end of June. Yeah.
Can the hairs that are shed off at a young age still maintain that toxicity for the 3 years you were talking about?
Yeah, so there's the literature has said that it's the third instar where they sort of develop those toxic hairs. Not certain that that's true, but that is what I have read. And yes, it can maintain that toxicity, but it's a lower level of the toxin in those smaller, instars. I think I'm terrible with remembering numbers, but I want to say it's like 0.005 inches or something like that is the length of the hairs that actually have the venom inside of them. So it's not the hairs that are really visible to the naked eye. It's microscopic hairs that have the venom.
We'll do in people's yards, when they're mowing their lawn, we've had customers tell us that they get it real bad after mowing the lawn. So can they become like an airborne nuisance pretty easily?
Yeah, it absolutely can. And one of the things that, we tell people to do is like mow their lawn on a wet day. I know that some of the professional lawn companies will use a surfactant. So they'll let the grass grow to like 4 inches, put a surfactant down and then mow, which sounds awful. But it's just trying to keep those hairs from flying around is really the key. I think we got to get moving.
Yeah. Blow it up.
All right. So I guess I recommend working in groups of 2 or 3, having somebody to pick up the webs, somebody to clip the webs, and.
What are we looking at? Is there some here?
Yeah, can you clip a couple?
You want me to
Show
clip a
us?
couple?
Pass them around in a bucket.
Oh, look at that. Don't even have to bend over.
There. So you can see the egg mass on there.
Oh, show me the egg mass.
The egg mass is right there.
Okay.
And then the caterpillars are inside. And I think I can probably tear this one open. I said they were so strong. Oh, maybe this is an older one. Maybe this is last year. I don't know, this is pretty flimsy. This one might be a spent one.
We should also tell people that don't trim trees all the time, to take as little of the branch as you can. Don't take more than you have to, because if a tree's totally infested and you take off a ton of the crown, you may not necessarily be helping the tree.
So I'm curious, are there trees that you would say, bulletproof, put this in your landscape, no problem with browntail moth? I mean, other than conifers.
Trees are actually probably pretty good because they're super tolerant of pruning. So if you knew you
Yeah.
were going to be infested for a long time, choosing something that's pruning tolerant might be better and is easier to manage because they don't get as tall.
Right.